Kindle in us the fire of your love. Send forth your breath, and we shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. It is good to be with you this morning on even such short notice as I had. I'm very sorry about Deb's being ill. I just saw her at the clergy retreat this past week, and I watched her progressively decline into the illness which is keeping her at home today. So we will keep her in our prayers for a quick but sure recovery. It has been about 20 years since I supplied here at Trinity, so it's good to come back every once in a while. In any case, I suspect that you viewed a different text than the one that I read from the Gospel book. Is that not the case?
Yeah.
There was a little bit of difference, okay, because there was no insert for the Gospel book with that particular reading on it. But sometimes it's good to see or hear two different translations at once. So you will pick up on different nuances that occur in any Gospel story or any reading that we might have. Today we are confronted with the last Sunday of Epiphany, the end of that season where there have been progressive revelations or disclosures, or what we would call epiphanies, about who this Jesus, whose birth and baptism we celebrated almost 50 days ago, how and what all that means. Who is this Jesus? And we have seen progressively through such things as changing water into wine, miracles of healing, all those things, some beginnings of some answers as to who Jesus might be, what Emmanuel, or God with us, might mean. And today we are confronted with what we often call, in our common everyday languages, a mountaintop experience. Not only for Jesus, but a mountaintop experience for those three disciples, leaders of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, whom he took with them up on the mountain. Mountaintop experiences are great moments in our lives. They are often few and far between. Maybe you can count two or three in your own life when you have been, well, perhaps caught by a magnificent sunrise or a view from a mountain on a summer's day of the glory of nature, and you think, my God, it's beautiful. Or a certain occasion, a wedding perhaps, where joy abounded, and you thought, this was really a joyful occasion. There have been many mountaintop experiences in one's life if we would keep them in mind and think about them. I have several, and I remember one in particular, and perhaps we're far enough removed from it so that you all won't worry about the politics involved. My wife and I, way back in 1968, so that's way before most of you were born, or ancient history, as those of you who are my age know, we were delegates from Clay County, Iowa, to the Democratic Convention in the state of Iowa. And we had gotten clean for Gene. Not that we were dirty to start with, but we had gotten clean for Eugene McCarthy. And we were there expecting to continue the momentum that went towards unseating Lyndon Johnson so that he wouldn't run again and that we could nominate someone else for president. And as I said, we were very dedicated to a particular candidate. And then, in the midst of this, into the convention came a surprise visitor, a very young Ted Kennedy. And when he came into the room, it was electric. I mean, his shirt was whiter than anybody else's white shirt. It was one of those moments. And we found ourselves up on our feet, some standing on chairs, yelling and clapping. And I thought to myself, what am I doing? I'm a delegate for somebody else, I'm doing this. Now again, put your mind away from the politics and think about it. This was a kind of mountaintop experience. Being swept up into the glory of the moment. Now again, forget the politics. This is what's going to happen to Peter, James, and John. This mountaintop experience. These things tend to happen on mountaintops in Scripture. Think of Moses having God revealing divine presence to him as the law is given. Think of Jesus himself going up again on a mountain to deliver the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew, telling us who are the blessed. And now we come again to this mountaintop experience where three disciples are given a vision of Jesus transfigured before them. Whiter than white is his raiment. An inner radiance, as the text you saw said, there was an inner light radiating from him. And they were terrified, it said in the reading that I had, maybe it was just a different bit in your reading, but they were terrified as this cloud overshadows them and they hear a voice, and we know who are listening to this gospel, it's the voice of God saying, "This is my son, listen to him." This is an epiphany, this is a divine revelation, this is a disclosure. It is perhaps the greatest disclosure in that series of disclosures that are the epiphanies of this past season as we now turn towards Lent. But it is interesting what they saw, is it not? They saw Moses and Elijah, and as the text you had in front of you said, in deep, deep conversation with Jesus. Deep conversation. Unfortunately, there was no tape recorder there. We didn't know what that was about. But I think we can suspect something. Because Moses represents something. Is an iconic figure in the history of God's dealing with humanity, in the history of our salvation. And Elijah, also an iconic figure. When I step back from this gospel reading this morning and think about that, I always wonder, and I'm kind of amused when I think about it, how did the disciples, Peter, James, and John, who have been swept up from being rather unlettered, I don't want to say ignorant, but unlettered fishermen, recognize Moses and Elijah? Now you might think to yourself, as I did with my perverse mind, well, obviously Moses had on the same patterned cloak that Charles of Heston wore in the Ten Commandments, and that's how we know it's Moses. And then we can make a surmise from looking at Elijah, because how? Because we've seen icons of Elijah in church, not bloody likely in a synagogue to see images. But someone who looks like a prophetic figure. So they recognize, at least in terms of our story, that this is Moses and Elijah. And then after the cloud has passed and their terror at this presence of God has subsided, the gospel says something very interesting. When everything had cleared away on their mountaintop, in their mountaintop experience, they saw only Jesus. Now, on the one hand, that could be a simple statement that everything had cleared away and only Jesus was standing there. But the evangelist, in this case Mark, wants us who hear this reading to see something a lot more profound. When Moses and Elijah have departed, they see Jesus only. That is to say, it's not that we're through with the law and the prophets, but that we've been brought up and into Jesus himself, so that he represents both the law and the prophets and something new Because the moment here, the mountaintop experience here, in Mark's Gospel, also in Matthew and Luke, the only three Gospels of the four that have a transfiguration story where Jesus is revealed on the other side, as it were, who he really is in raiment white and glistening. In this Gospel, the transfiguration is the turning point. Each Gospel has two parts: the public ministry of Jesus and the passion. That's easy to remember. P and P, public ministry, passion. And the hinge point, the turning point in the Gospel, the moment of revelation that is this morning's Gospel at the end of the Epiphany season and as we look towards Lent, is this: that when Jesus comes down from the mountain, his face is set towards Jerusalem and his passion. It's the point in the Gospel where the story turns from public ministry to passion. And that is true in Matthew and in Luke's Gospel also, with the story of the Transfiguration. Footnote: John's Gospel does not have a Transfiguration story. He doesn't need one. Jesus has been who he is very clearly from the beginning. The Word that created the cosmos has been made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That happens in the first chapter. So we know who Jesus is all the way through John's Gospel. And a footnote. Okay, back to today's Gospel. This is the turning point for them. This is the turning point we're going to learn from mountaintop experiences, from the revelation, from the epiphany, from the disclosure. And Jesus says two things to them, which are the point of this story for you and me today, as we come off the mountain with our faces set towards Jerusalem in Lent and towards the Holy Week of Jesus' Passion and the celebration of his resurrection. Jesus says two things. Say nothing of this to anyone. That's half of his two-point commandment. Episcopalians have been tremendously obedient to this commandment over the years of not telling anyone about it. But then he says, but after the Son of Man is raised, or as it said in the text you read on the screens, after the resurrection, let everyone know. So out of this mountaintop experience comes this word to you and me. Ponder in your hearts in silence what this epiphany means. And then when the time comes,